As you might have guessed from the title of his talk, Professor Messina is most definitely a Kant expert, but his expertise extends beyond Kant to other early modern figures such as Newton, Leibniz, and Wolff. Professor Messina is a renowned scholar, having published in the very top academic journals for the history of philosophy and Kant studies, as well as contributing to important critical guides and essay collections. He has also given more than 40 talks throughout North America and Europe. You're in for an engaging evening because Professor Messina is also an extremely popular professor whose classes are sought out. As evidence, he's received the University Housing Honored Instructor Award 3 times, which is based on student nomination. Professor Messina is currently working on a book entitled Kant on the Metaphysics of Space, Nature, and God. The title of the talk tonight is Kant's Philosophical Revolution, His Radical View of Reality and Faith. Please join me in welcoming Professor Messina.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out. I'm really happy about the standing room only crowd. I'm sure it has nothing to do with me offering credit to my students in my class for it. Okay. A lot of us probably have some idea of the French Revolution, various images that we associate with the French Revolution, like bloody heads rolling from guillotines and people storming the Bastille and impaling people's heads on spikes and all kinds of grisly imagery like that. And maybe we also have more positive images too in our heads of people shouting fraternity and equality in the streets and political reform and those kinds of things. And many of us probably also have ideas of the scientific revolution, particular images that we associate with the scientific revolution, like Copernicus's heliocentric model of the universe and Galileo's house imprisonment for defending this new theory of the world. Kant's philosophical revolution is intertwined with both the French Revolution and with the scientific revolution. Kant, when we're going to get into this image that Kant uses from the scientific revolution, from Copernicus, to illustrate his own new philosophical idea, but Kant also saw himself as making movements in philosophy that were mirroring political developments of the time, people challenging political authority based on reason. And his contemporaries drew parallels between what he was doing in philosophy and various events in the French Revolution. So Heinrich Heine, for instance, has this very nice description of Kant as a terrorist in the realm of ideas, comparable to Robespierre. So he's thinking of Kant like guillotining various philosophical theories that came before him. As with all philosophical revolutionaries, though, there's disagreements about how to view Kant's legacy and how to understand his revolution. So we have these kind of negative pictures of Kant, like from Heinrich Heine. Moses Mendelssohn, one of Kant's contemporaries, referred to Kant as the all-destroying Kant. Heinrich von Kleist liked Kant's philosophy, but the only problem was that it led to suicidal despair, and it led to him ultimately deciding that there was no point in trying to pursue his life's work anymore, and so he killed himself. So that's kind of a critical stance on Kant's philosophy. Lately, by more recent people, Kant has been called the first woke philosopher, and he's been blamed for critical race theory or praised for it, depending on who you ask. Arthur Schopenhauer had this very positive view of Kant, compared him to a kind of cataract surgeon who helps us to really see what's going on for the first time. Okay, so let's get into this central image that Kant connects to his new philosophical understanding. Kant's Copernican revolution is often called, right? So you have in mind Copernicus' view. Copernicus has a heliocentric view of the universe, which says, right, the sun is at the center of things and the earth is revolving around it. The central idea of Kant's Copernican revolution can be put into the phrase that in fact, despite what people might tell you, the world really does revolve around you, or actually it revolves around me in particular. Kant is actually inverting Copernicus' central idea in a certain way. So the Copernican revolution says that reality, as we experience it, or the world as we experience it, must conform to our mind's inbuilt requirements. Sometimes he calls them forms or laws for representing things and for experiencing things, rather than vice versa. So there's a common sense picture that you might have of how experience and how knowledge works, where you've got the world on one side, and the world is the way that it is, and when you experience it, your experience faithfully reflects the way that the world is, and you represent it as thus and so, because it is, in fact, in itself, thus and so. But Kant thought that that way of thinking about things was mistaken. He thought that actually it's the other way around. He thought that there are certain laws or rules that are inbuilt into our mind. Right? So we have Kant's Denkhaube here, Kant's thinking cap. And he's playing a game of billiards, which is one of his favorite hobbies here. The idea is that his mind comes wired with these different ways of representing things, like reality and substance and space and time. And the thought behind the Copernican revolution is that the world as we experience it has to conform to those inbuilt ways of representing it. So the world as we experience it is going to be certain kinds of ways, like it's going to have cause and effect relationships, because we have to represent it that way. So he's flipping the explanatory relationship that you find in the common sense picture of how experience works. So this view is a kind of idealist view, because it's saying that reality as we experience it depends on our minds. It is mind dependent in certain respects. This is text from Kant. I couldn't help but give you a few quotations from Kant, but I'll try to gloss them the best that I can. Kant says in the Critique of Pure Reason, up to now, it has been assumed that all our cognition must conform to the objects. That's the common sense model, where our minds faithfully mirror the way that reality is. Our minds have to conform to the world. But all attempts to find out something about them a priori, and I'm going to explain these terms because people hate Kanti's, I know. Find out something about them a priori have come to nothing. Hence, let us try whether we do not get farther with the problems of metaphysics by assuming that the objects must conform to our cognition. This would be just like the first thoughts of Copernicus, who, when he did not make good progress in the explanation of the celestial motions, if he assumed the entire celestial host revolved around the observer, tried to see whether he might not have greater success if he made the observer revolve and left the stars at rest. So like Copernicus, Kant is rethinking the perceiver-reality relationship. Again, he's thinking that the world as we perceive it or observe it must conform to our mind's inbuilt forms of representation. But in a way, this is the reverse of what Copernicus was saying, because Kant's saying, right, we call the shots and the world has to conform to us. Whereas Copernicus's idea, in a sense, was that the sun is at the center and we're revolving around it. For Kant, in a sense, reality revolves around us, or reality as we experience it revolves around us. Okay, what does a priori mean? A priori means independent of experience. So Kant thinks that there's knowledge that we have that doesn't come from experience. We can talk about that more in the Q&A if you want. This term metaphysics that Kant uses. By metaphysics, Kant means a field of inquiry that tries to get a priori knowledge of the nature of reality. He also sees metaphysics as dealing with specific concepts like substance or cause and effect or God and space, where these are concepts that you might think don't really come, or it's not clear how they could come from sense impressions or sense experience. I don't know the last time you saw God, but that didn't happen to me. Likewise, with space and causation, various philosophers have arguments according to which we don't really have any experience or any sense impressions of those things. And then finally, by metaphysics, Kant is thinking of the sort of inquiry that previous philosophers like Descartes and Leibniz and Spinoza engaged in. So this is a kind of armchair investigation of the world where you purport to be able to establish various fundamental truths about reality. So Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz, who I'm going to pick on throughout this talk, thought that he could show through an a priori argument that the world is ultimately made up of these fundamental entities that he called monads, which he thought were immaterial mind-like entities that formed the fundamental basis of reality. So Hume comes along, and Hume famously said, this is garbage, throw this in the fire. Literally said, what do these guys think that they're doing? They just can't do this sort of thing that they think that they're doing. They're just mistaken. We can't establish these kinds of things. But Kant comes along, and Kant has a different attitude towards this picture. And again, in the Q&A, we can talk more about what Kant is doing. Okay, so this Copernican revolution, this new idealistic view of reality, where reality as we experience it must conform to our minds and must depend on our minds in certain respects. It includes a radical new answer to the question, what is space? By space here, I mean physical space. This is the space in which bodies exist. This is the collection of all places. This encompasses outer space, but is not limited to it. This is the space that contains us, in which we all are moving around in right now. Earlier philosophers had inquired into physical space, and they had asked various questions about it. They had asked, is it material, like the physical objects in it, or is it immaterial? Is everything whatsoever that exists somewhere in space? Does space exist with absolute necessity? Is it the kind of thing that can be annihilated? If God wanted to annihilate it, could God annihilate it? Does space exist independent of physical objects and their relations? If you took away all of the physical objects that there are, would space cease to exist at the same time? And relatedly, they ask various questions about motion, right? So we all know that there's such a thing as relative motion. When I move relative to the podium right now, that's relative motion. But you might wonder, could there be such a thing as absolute motion, where you're not moving relative to bodies, but relative to space itself? What are the properties of space? Is it necessarily three-dimensional? Is it necessarily unitary? Is it necessarily infinite? Is it finite? And what sort of existence does it have? Is it like a thing or a substance? Or is that not the right way to think about it at all? So most philosophers in this tradition before Kant had assumed that space is mind independent, that space is something that exists apart from our minds. But not Kant. No, not at all. So Kant advocates what I'll call spatial idealism. He thinks that space and the spatiality of the physical world are contributed by our minds. Space, he says, is the a priori form of sensibility. You're going to get mad at me. Sensibility. What do I mean by that? I mean, we have a power of perception. That's what he means by sensibility. And space, according to him, is an inbuilt form, or you might just use the word law, according to which this power works. Now, various people have come up with colorful analogies to try to illustrate the Kantian idea. Heinrich von Kleist, who I've already mentioned, had this metaphor of spectacles. So his thought was, what Kant is saying, in effect, is that we come into the world wearing these space glasses that we can't ever take off, right? Just like if you came into the world wearing green glasses, everything would appear to you to be green. You come into the world wearing these space glasses, and as a result, everything appears to you to be spatial. But if you could look at the world without having those glasses on, as maybe somebody like God does, the world wouldn't be spatial. You would see that it's not really that way. One problem with this analogy, again, is that Kleist killed himself based on it, so I'd like to find another one. Hegel's got a different analogy. So Hegel thinks, the world's like a bowl of spaghetti. And space and time are like your mouth and your teeth. And experience is like eating. Right? So you dive into the bowl of spaghetti, munch it all up with your spatial forms and your temporal forms, and you digest it, and that's what experiencing objects is. Right? And so you transform those objects as you experience them into the nasty stuff inside your stomach. But the problem with that analogy is that it's really gross. So Messina came up with this other one a few days ago. It says that space is like the law of universal gravitation. Outer objects given to our sensibility are necessarily presented to us in space because of this form or this law of our sensibility. Just like planets, when they're around a star, necessarily present with an orbital path because of the gravitation of the sun and because of the law of universal gravitation. And I like this analogy because it fits with what my mom told me, which is that you're a star. So here are some quotations in which we find Kant articulating this spatial idealistic view. Space is nothing other than the subjective condition of sensibility. We can accordingly speak of space, extended beings, spatial beings, and so on, only from the human standpoint. If we remove our own subject, or even only the subjective constitution of the senses in general, then all relations of objects in space and time, indeed space and time themselves, would disappear. Now, I want to relate these passages to a quotation that you might already be familiar with, maybe the astronomers here. I guess they invited the astronomy department. This one sounds more inspirational. Two things, Kant's most famous line, right? This is like the hit. Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and reverence. The more often and more steadily one reflects on them. The starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. But what people don't often read is later in the passage where it actually gets a lot more troubling, because he says, the first view, right, looking at the starry skies above you, you're out there in the field and you're looking up, thinking, oh, how great it is out there, and you've got this feeling of awe and the sublime. It annihilates my importance as an animal creature. So Kant seems to think that if space were something outside of our mind, right, and starry skies above us are completely outside of our minds, that is the most depressing and terrifying thought that you could have when you go out and look at the night sky and realize these new astronomical pictures that they're giving you, where you're just the tiniest, insignificant, loathsome, repulsive mite, louse, I guess, in this huge, enormous spatial world. It absolutely annihilates your importance as a creature, unless you can take Kant's view of space, which in a way puts space back into us, rather than leaving us entirely in it and completely eclipsed into insignificance by it. And he also has other reasons for thinking that if you don't take up this picture on space, right, this very counterintuitive, radical, revolutionary picture, then human dignity and morality are going to be themselves completely destroyed. This moral law within me is going to be annihilated as well. Kant was so proud of this line that he had, he actually put it on his tombstone. Zwei Dinge, so the two things that fill me with ever more admiration and awe. If I ever come up with a great line, I'm going to put it on my tombstone too. All right, so I'm going to explore some, and I'm getting out of actually saying what I'm going to do. I'm going to explore some dimensions of Kant's radical view of space and consider some of the reasons behind it. And the proposal I want to make is that we can better understand Kant's account of space when we consider the following. the early modern debates about physical space to which he was responding, and Kant's own earlier pre-critical is earlier in life theorizing about space. Now, scholars, I think, tisk, they've neglected 1 and 2, but that leaves room for Messina. And in fact, Kant himself actually discourages us from taking this approach to understanding his philosophy. But I'm a little bit of a rebel myself, and so I'm going to actually follow the spirit as opposed to the letter of Kant's philosophy, because he's the guy who said, think for yourself after all. And I'm going to go against Kant in order to make sense of his philosophical picture. And I've got a foil, or an enemy, if you will, who's dead and so conveniently can't respond. So here's one take. Allison says that Kant's idealistic claim that space is the form of sensibility. He says it's not a claim about the real nature of space and time. Instead, it's meant as an alternative to ontology. By ontology, he means metaphysics. And Allison goes on to say, Henry Allison, rather than making an original move in the same game, Kant is playing a whole new game. Now that sounds pretty cool, I admit. Kant is playing three-dimensional chess, right? Everybody else was playing the game of metaphysics. And Kant's like, I'm doing this whole new thing. I call it transcendental philosophy. I'm awesome. But I think that that's not right, as cool as it sounds. I'm going to claim that Kant is giving an account of the real nature of space, and that he actually arrives at it by borrowing from his predecessors and from his earlier self. Now maybe he's playing a new game too, and we can talk about that. But sometimes, if you're really smart, you can play a new game and also beat somebody else in an old game at the same time, right? Three-dimensional chess, and you can also make a move in two-dimensional chess at the same time. So maybe that's what's going on. But I really want to argue against this idea that Kant's not making a claim about the real nature of space and time, and that he's not in dialogue with earlier debates about the nature of space. So putting this in slogan form, my Kant is a conservative revolutionary, paradoxical, or conservatively radical. And this is what you might expect from a guy who famously went for the same walk at the same time every single day, or the guy who was really enthusiastic about the French Revolution, but also argued in his moral philosophy that there's actually no right to revolution, and so you probably shouldn't be doing that, right? You would expect that there would be a conservative element in this guy's revolutionary picture. So here's my plan. I'm going to give you, and this will only take about an hour and a half, an overview of Kant's philosophical career. I'm going to talk about some underappreciated aspects of Kant's mature account of space, which I think motivate a look back to these earlier debates about space to which he was responding. Then I'm going to look at the evolution of Kant's views on space over time, and then I'm going to conclude. So here we've got Kant at various stages of his career. We have the young, hot Kant on the left. We have the Kant death mask on the right, and middle age in between. Kant lived from 1724 to 1804. As you probably know, he lived his entire life in and around what was then called Königsberg, Prussia, which is present-day Kaliningrad, Russia. When Frederick the Great was traveling through Königsberg, he said, this is a better place for raising bears than for science, which it probably was. One thing that Königsberg was known for was that it had these bridges that led to this question of whether somebody could devise a path through the city, crossing each one of those bridges exactly once. And Euler, the mathematician and scientist, solved this problem. And so I like the idea that this guy who was deeply interested in questions about space and the properties of space comes from this town that's associated with these, what led to the science of topology, these questions about these spatial relationships and what's spatially possible and not spatially possible. So people typically divide Kant's career into three phases. There's the pre-critical or hot Kant phase, 1746 to 1770. There's the silent decade, And then there's the critical or the mature period from 1780 to 1790s. The pre-critical Kant doesn't get a lot of love from Kant scholars, but I think that's a huge shame because the stuff that he wrote during that time was immensely interesting. Kant published on a wide range of topics, both philosophical and scientific. He wrote on fire, volcanoes, tides, the orbit of the Earth, all kinds of natural phenomena like that. And he was interested in cosmogony, the origin of the universe. During this period, Kant was trying to synthesize the ideas of these German metaphysicians like Leibniz with the new ideas of Newton. And this period led to works like the famous Universal Natural History and Theory of the Heavens that any astronomers here will probably have heard of, because I would think, because in it, Kant argues for, and is one of the first people to argue for, in fact, is the first person to argue for the so-called nebular hypothesis, that the solar system arises from clouds of interstellar dust and debris. And we can also see him wrestling with the Leibnizian legacy, this term, right, monad. Well, Kant does Leibniz one better. I got a monad for you, and they called that the physical monadology. What I care about though is this focus throughout the critical period. It's the search for a workable account of the nature of space. If you look at these pre-critical texts, throughout them, Kant is talking over and over again about what space is, about what its properties are, about how it exists. And he says in a quotation that I really like, metaphysics seeks to discover the nature of space and establish the ultimate principles in terms of which its possibility can be understood. The silent decade I like because Kant, in 1771 had just gotten tenure, and he kept saying, "Oh, this book, I got this great book that's going to be called The Critique of Pure Reason. It'll be out in a year." Fucking no! It took 11 years, and he didn't really publish anything during this time, so that's why it's called the silent decade. So I kind of relate to that. Then you have the critical Kant, the mature Kant. In his 50s and 60s. This is the Kant that is most known, and what people sometimes forget was he was already, no offense, but really, really old at this point, in his 50s and 60s. But the inspiring thing here is that this is when, he did his most revolutionary work. So this is when he wrote these three critiques that he's famous for: the Critique of Pure Reason, the Critique of Practical Reason, and the Critique of Judgment. This is when we get this Copernican revolution. This is where Kant offers this new take on theoretical philosophy. By theoretical philosophy, he means the part of philosophy that deals with questions about reality and questions about how we can know it. He says the goal of his theoretical philosophy is to put this thing that's in trouble, metaphysics, right, that Hume threw in the fire, put it back on a secure path of a science. And if you want, we can talk about that more. But during this period, Kant is very dismissive about his earlier self. He says, look, I was in a dogmatic slumber. That's his nice expression. I was in a dogmatic slumber throughout my earlier career. I wasn't thinking critically. And he thought that his earlier works were worthless. And he didn't think that they needed to be reissued. He thought that they were garbage. But I think that's completely wrong because they actually hold the key to understanding his later theories. Okay, some underappreciated aspects of Kant's critical theory of space. Allison is wrong. Henry Allison, right, who said that Kant is not asking about the real nature of space. Kant is inquiring into the real nature of space in his critical works, just as he did in the pre-critical period. So Kant asks towards the beginning of the Critique of Pure Reason, what are space and time? If that's not a metaphysical question, take my degree away because I don't know anything. Right? Compare that quotation, which is from the Critique of Pure Reason, to this remark from his earlier philosophy, that metaphysics seeks to discover the nature of space and establish the ultimate principles in terms of which its possibility can be understood. I think that's exactly what Kant is doing himself in his Critique of Pure Reason when he offers this new theory of space. And not only do I think that Allison is wrong and that Kant is playing this old game of asking about the nature of space and offering a metaphysical picture, but it's actually very complicated. It has a number of different moving parts that often aren't appreciated. So remember the earlier questions that philosophers asked about space. Is it material or immaterial? Does it exist with necessity? What properties does it have? What sort of existence does it have? This is actually my favorite thing in this whole talk. You take nothing away from the talk. Watch that crab's claw. It's insane. Look what a claw does. So there's further parts of Kant's metaphysics of space beyond this claim that space depends on our minds. Kant says that space would exist even if physical objects did not. He thinks that it exists with necessity. He says of space that it grounds the possibility of physical objects and their relations. So he thinks that it's somehow prior in its existence to physical objects and their relations. And he thinks that space has various necessary intrinsic properties. So it's necessarily three-dimensional, he thinks. It's infinite. He thinks it's unitary. So he thinks that as a matter of necessity, there can only be one space. So between any two bodies, there's necessarily going to be some spatial path. And he thinks that space is necessarily orientable. And by an orientable space, I mean a space that admits this distinction, the distinction between clockwise and counterclockwise, between right and left hands. This crab space, this Mobius strip, that's not an orientable space because the right and left switch as the crab goes to the loop. So these are parts of Kant's metaphysics of space. But wait, there's more. There's even more to the story. Kant also claims that there's no such thing as absolute motion or absolute place. He thinks that space and its parts they're not like substance-like entities, nor do they exist as real things or objects. And he thinks that not everything that exists in space. He thinks that there's some objects that exist that are not in space, like God, for instance, and like the human soul, for instance. So here's a key question. We have this package of metaphysical views that Kant holds, right? The ones that I just showed you, as well as this spatial idealism claiming that space is the form of human sensibility. How is this package of views supposed to go together? And what are Kant's reasons for accepting it? It's not immediately obvious how, if at all, these claims relate to Kant's idealism about space. And these questions, I think, right, we've got a mystery, and I think this motivates a look back at the debates about space to which Kant was responding, as well as his earlier attempts to come up with a viable theory of space. So that's what I'm going to do now. We've got Isaac Newton, we've got some nice wigs here. We have Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz trying to outdo Christian Wolff, who's got the better wig, and Christian Crusius has a pretty good one too. Newton just goes au naturel. I like that. So here's one famous debate about space that was incredibly important for Kant's philosophical development. Like the most important thing in the 18th century. That's an exaggeration. There were, earthquakes that killed tons of people, but pretty important. Next to those things, people didn't have Twitter, and so these debates were like, what you did. The Leibniz-Clark correspondence was a series of letters exchanged between our friend Leibniz and Samuel Clarke. And it deals with all kinds of questions about Newton's philosophy, including absolute space. Clarke, many people think, is basically just kind of Newton's henchman in this debate. Basically, Newton's telling him, take this, go to left, hit him with a jab. That he's telling him the kind of lines to take against Leibniz. And so it sheds a lot of light on Newton's thinking and the ways in which these two theories of space are at odds. So a little bit of background to this debate. In the Principia Mathematica, Newton defends the idea of absolute space. The idea that space is an immaterial, necessary thing that exists in its own right, apart from bodies and their relations. So that was my attempt to try to depict Newtonian space. People call this the serial box view of space, or the container view of space. The idea is that space is this kind of infinite container that's immaterial, that bodies are in and then they move around. And so I also tried to depict, right, the sun, I drew it up there, and some of the planets, but the drawing app didn't work that well. I tried to fill out the physical universe there. So Newton thought that you've got this absolute space that's something separate from the bodies in space and their relations. He thought that if you destroyed all the bodies, this space would still be there. And he thought that the different parts of this space, he called them absolute places. And his thought is that there's a difference between all of these different parts of space. So I called one there in the corner, Point George. They all are numerically different from one another. And his idea is that not only do bodies have relative motion when they move in relation to one another, but they also move in relation to these points in this serial box, like Point George. And when they move in relation to those points, that's what he calls absolute motion. So Newton ends up defending absolute space, absolute place, and absolute motion. Now, one important thing that's going to matter for understanding the debate between Newton and Leibniz is that given that these points, these absolute places, are all distinct from one another, the physical universe, which you might think of as, right, the set of all the bodies that exist, right, all the galaxies, all those bodies, they're depicted here with this circle. Now, that physical universe is going to have to be somewhere within this structure. And it's going to be somewhere in relation to our friend Point George here. And this is where Leibniz's argument gets off the ground. The Leibniz thinks that everything has to have a reason. And he calls this the principle of sufficient reason. Premise one: if there's absolute space, then the physical universe must be located in some part of absolute space rather than another. Now, I think Newton would accept this premise. Right? That's exactly the kind of thing that I was illustrating just now. It's got to be, it's got to be on some set of those points, some set of those absolute places. But there can be no reason why the universe is placed in this absolute place rather than another. Sometimes he couches this in terms of God. Leibniz says, God could have no reason for placing the universe here as opposed to over here, nearer to Point George. Because all of these different points, these absolute places, they're distinct, but they're all qualitatively alike. There's nothing special about any of them that could constitute a reason for placing the physical universe nearer to one set of points rather than another. It's not like there's some glowing orb near Point George that makes it especially cool. Leibniz argues there can be no reason why the universe is placed in this absolute place rather than another. But according to Leibniz, there's a reason for everything. And so Leibniz argues that there can't be this thing, absolute space, because it violates the principle of sufficient reason. And Leibniz has various other arguments against this position that we can talk more about in the Q&A. One of them is theological. The thought is that if there were this infinite absolute space that exists, well, God was commonly thought to be the only infinite substance that exists. If Newton's right, and then there's this absolute space that's an infinite entity, then Newton's got this dilemma. He's either got to say that there's this second kind of godlike being that exists alongside of God, that God is unable to destroy or do anything with, or Newton can try to say that this absolute space is itself somehow just God. But that brings with it its own can of worms, because that smacks of pantheism and spinicism. And so Newton's on tough theological ground with this theory of space. Leibniz, for his part, thinks absolute space, there's no such thing. There's no such thing as absolute motion. There's no such thing as absolute place. All motion is relative. And he says that what space is, basically is just a kind of network of relations among bodies. He likens it to a family tree, right? Where, just like there's no entity that exists here, that's the family tree, over and beyond these various relations that the family members stand into, so there's no space that exists as something over and beyond bodies and the various relations that they stand into each other. Now you can form by abstraction, an idea of this tree structure without any of the bodies in it. And that's what you're doing when you think of a completely empty space. But that's not something that could actually exist. That's not a real kind of entity. That's merely an abstract idea. For Leibniz, if you remove the bodies from the world, you destroy space. It goes away because space just consists in bodies and their relations. Now, later figures in German philosophy continue to debate what is space. But these later debates are interestingly different because they incorporate language and concerns that are characteristic of post-Leibnizian German rationalism. These philosophers, like Christian Wolff and Christian Baumgarten, or Alexander Baumgarten, they're obsessed with questions about explanatory grounds, questions about what grounds what explains what's more basic than what, like a lot of metaphysicists are today. They publish these papers about what grounds what. They should like these German rationalists because they were doing the same thing. And they took these questions about space and they couched them in terms of these questions about explanatory grounds. They asked, is space the ground of objects and their relations, or do objects and their relations ground space? And they were also very interested in questions about the correct analysis of concepts and the correct definitions of concepts. They asked, can space be defined in some non-spatial terms? This is from our library. So you think you might be that Christian Wolff is like some guy that you never heard of before. He's all over our library. There's like 5 shelves in our library just devoted to the works of Christian Wolff. He wrote all those things, all of those different books. He was extremely prolific. So here's just one passage that he wrote. Now, what space is? When many things that exist at the same time and are not identical are represented as outside one another, a certain order among them thereby arises, such that when I take one of them as the first, I take another as the second, another as the third, yet another as the fourth, and so on. And as soon as we represent this order to ourselves, we represent space to ourselves. For this reason, if we do not want to consider the object differently from how we cognize it, we must take space to be the order of those things that coexist. So that's what he's saying space is. It's an order of things that coexist. That's his definition or analysis of the concept of space. And thus, no space can exist if things are not present to fill it, although it's still distinct from these things. Alexander Baumgarten, his definition of what space is, he said, it's the order of coexistent things mutually posited outside of one another. Now, remember that these people were trying to give a definition of space, and this is something that we try to do too when we give definitions, right? You don't want to use the term that you're defining in your definition. That's not a very good definition. And so notice this phrase, this suspicious phrase of outside of one another. So you might think, that's not so good for what you're trying to do. And Christian Crusius calls Baumgarten and Wolff out on precisely that point. He thinks, look, you guys are giving this circular analysis of what space is. For Crusius, I'm not going to read the quote, space is conceptually and explanatorily basic. You can't analyze the concept further into some more basic set of concepts. And it's also explanatorily basic. It's not that you first have this order of coexistent things that somehow ground space. For Crusius, space is itself a ground of the possibility for things existing and for coexisting. So when you have things coexisting, space has to come first and make that possible. It's not something that arises out of a bunch of things coexisting with each other. All right, evolution of Kant's views on space. So as I've been saying, throughout Kant's whole long career, he pursued these questions about space, right? All of these questions. What is it? How can we analyze it? How can we define it? What are its properties? Kant is consistently sympathetic to Leibniz's criticisms of Newtonian absolute space and absolute motion, right? He agrees with Leibniz's criticisms. He thinks that they're right. He thinks there can't be such a thing as absolute motion or objects having absolute places. He accepts those arguments. In his earliest publications, he defends his own version of a kind of relationalist theory, where you try to explain space in terms of objects standing in certain types of relations with each other. So in this work that he wrote in 1726, it's actually extremely interesting, despite being something that Kant wrote when he was 26, because he's contemplating the possibility of spaces that have more than 3 dimensions. He thinks it's totally a contingent fact about the space of our universe that it has 3 dimensions. He's trying to give an account, an explanation for why it is that space is 3-dimensional. And he thinks that it's because that the objects, the physical bodies in our universe, act on each other according to an inverse square law. He thinks that's what explains why space is 3-dimensional. But he thinks that it didn't have to be, and if there were an inverse cube law or other types of laws, then you'd have a whole different number of spatial dimensions. But Kant came to have his doubts about his earlier relationalist theory and relationalist theories more generally. And I think we can formulate his doubts into 2 types of worries. There's worries about the concept of space not really being further analyzable into more basic notions, like the notion of forces and laws. He becomes skeptical that you can actually explain space in those terms. And relatedly, there's a worry about the correct direction of explanation. So there's a question, right? Do space and its properties ground the possibility of objects and their relations, or is it the other way around? You might, thinking back to this theory we just gave, you might say, there's something weird about this account. Kant's trying to explain space in terms of physical things acting according to an inverse square law of gravitation. Don't you already need to have those physical objects in space in order to be able to understand how they can be acting on one another in an inverse square law? Kant's theory seems to fly in the face of that kind of common sense idea. These worries come to a head in this piece that Kant wrote, and our friend the Crab finally came back. This piece that Kant published in 1768 called Directions in Space, where he asks, what accounts for the difference between right and left hands, right? Interesting fact, maybe not. I can't put a left hand into a right glove, or my left hand into a right glove, or at least it won't fit very well. Why is that, right? What accounts for this difference between right and left hands? And what accounts for the very possibility of such objects as these, which he calls incongruent counterparts? Kant argues that the relationalists can't explain this. You can talk more about this in the Q&A if you want. His own view is that my hand's rightness, right, the fact that this is a right hand, it depends on how it's embedded in space as a whole. This space's intrinsic properties are what disallow this hand turning into a left hand. So more generally, Kant thinks that you've got to have some sort of encompassing container space with various intrinsic properties to ground facts about spatial possibility and spatial impossibility. So why is it that a 2-sided enclosed rectilinear figure is impossible, or so Kant thought? It's because of the space that it's embedded in. Why is it that incongruent counterparts are possible? It's because of the space that they're embedded in. Why is it that you can't have two existing physical objects that are not connected by a spatial path? Because the space that they're embedded in rules that out as impossible. Why is it that there can be triangles? It's because of the space that it's embedded in, and the properties of that space. I'm almost done, don't worry. So Kant is in a weird place though in 1768. So he thinks that the relationalist can't be right, but he also accepts Leibniz's criticisms of the Newtonian position. And this includes doubting that space is a substance-like thing or that it's a real object. It also includes doubts about whether there could be absolute motion. Kant thinks that there's things that are right about both of these positions, but also wrong about these two different positions. And remember, his project all through this has been, he wants to explain the possibility of space. This is just a slide with these various commitments from earlier. And it said, Kant has this complex metaphysics of space. It includes all of these different claims. Now we can label them and say, right, these are commitments that he shares in common with Newton, what you might call a substantivalist. These are commitments that he shares in common with Leibniz, the relationalists. And he wants to hold on to both of these commitments because of arguments favoring both sides. So my proposal, which I finally come to, that Kant comes up with the idea of space as a form of sensibility precisely in order to be able to reconcile and conserve all of these commitments that he's come to from grappling with these earlier debates. And this fits with the fact that he first formulates around this time this famous theory of space as depending on our mind. Kant says around this time that he was hit with a great light. I'm always waiting for me to be hit with my great light. He was hit with a great light. And so one thought is that, right, that was what the great light was that, you know, he thought to himself, I've got these different commitments. I really wish I could hold on to them all. And I also don't want to feel like a piece of crap, right? Like I am if the physical space exists outside of me. I want to square all these things together, and I want to explain the possibility of space. Boom! Space is a form of sensibility. He thinks allows him to conserve all of these different commitments. I really am almost done here. I love that crowd. If space is a form of sensibility and a condition on the possibility of experience, as Kant is saying, then all of the following things can be true of it. That it precedes physical objects and grounds the possibility of them in their relations. That it disallows some properties and relations as impossible, right? Like two physical objects that aren't connected by a spatial path. That it's not a substance-like or real object, because a form of sensibility is not a substance-like thing or real object. That it disallows absolute motion and absolute place. And that it does not apply to all existing objects. This Kant's idea is that space as a form of sensibility is going to just apply to objects insofar as I sense them. But if there are things that I cannot sense, like, say, God or my soul, then space is not going to apply to those objects. You know, it's like he had the commitments on the left and the commitments on the right, and it was like, oh, I wish I could put these hands in the same glove. And he found out how to do it with the form of sensibility thesis. Conclusion. I'm almost done now. So I gave you an overview of Kant's philosophical career and the different stages of it. I talked about these underappreciated aspects of Kant's mature account of space. Right? So I was saying he's got all of these metaphysical commitments about space. And there's a question about how they all go together and why he believes them. And I said, well, to answer this question, we need to look at the debates that shaped his development, and we need to look at his own development over time. So kind of big picture now, on my view, Kant is a conservative revolutionary who is building on and consolidating earlier insights. It's the play a game thing. My wife told me that. So Kant is not a terrorist or a Robespierre who's guillotining, metaphysics and sending the heads on the ground. Can we do that? Yeah. Sending the metaphysical debates to the ground. Contrary to Allison, Kant is making a new move in an old game, the game of metaphysics. And this, that asks these questions about, what space is and about its properties and about its relationship to physical objects. Kant is very much steeped in those debates. Now, this is consistent with Kant's also playing a new game. If people want, we can talk about this new transcendental philosophy and all the other things that are going on in Kant's work. Finally, on my view, this part of Kant's philosophical revolution, this Copernican revolution, makes reality depend on our minds, which is connected with this idea that space depends on our minds. This philosophical revolution is only fully intelligible when we view it in the context of earlier debates about space and in the context of Kant's earlier works. Even if Kant tells us not to do that, damn it, that's what we have to do. Thank you.